Hey guys, tonight we step into a moonlit world where stones feel like they are holding their breath, where a wall of rock sits so neatly on another that your mind keeps searching for the hidden seam, and where the air smells faintly of dust and cold lichen as you run your fingertips along something that has outlasted empires. We are exploring the question, what if the world's megaliths point to a civilization erased from history? And we are going to do it this safe, sane way. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, what if imagination? Because this topic might feel like a treasure map, but it can also be a fog machine if you let it. You might not survive this, in the sense that you probably will not survive trying to move a 10-ton stone with a rope you bought online. So let's keep our ambition cozy and our claims cautious. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are here, drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I love imagining these stories drifting into bedrooms and late-night kitchens all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the presence of a boulder that has been promoted from rock to statement. Not because it has a plaque, not because it has a gift shop, but because it carries intention. You can feel it in the way the surface changes from wild to worked, in the way angles repeat, as if a mind not weather insisted on a plan. Most historians agree that humans have been shaping stone for a very long time, and not just for survival, but for meaning markers, tombs, shrines, meeting places, monuments that say, we were here and we mattered. Archaeology suggests that building big with stone is not a single invention from a single place, but a behavior that appears again and again when people have enough stability to think beyond tomorrow's meal. The evidence we do have points to communities organizing labor-gathering materials and investing time into something that does not feed you directly, but feeds the story of who you are. And still you are here looking at a block that seems too heavy for the back and shoulders of ordinary life. You cannot help it. Your brain is a pattern-making machine, and it wants an explanation that fits snugly. One interpretation is that the size itself is the message of society, proving it can coordinate, persuade, and endure. Another interpretation is more technical and quieter. Maybe the people who built this had methods we do not commonly teach in school. Not because they were magical, but because their day-to-day problem solving was tuned to stone, the way ours is tuned to screens. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So let's put a little compass in your palm, not the dramatic kind that spins toward destiny, but the humble brass kind you might buy at a market stall, the kind that squeaks when you open the lid. You keep it as a motif, a reminder that we are orienting ourselves through uncertainty. You are not hunting a hidden truth tonight. You are following clues. What's broadly accepted is that megalithic monuments show up in many regions and many eras, from prehistoric stone circles and dolmens to later massive platforms and walls. The mainstream frame is straightforward. People quarry stone shape, transport it, and stack it using muscle wood, fiber, gravity, and patience. Sometimes the stone is dragged on sledges. Sometimes it is rolled on logs. Sometimes it is inched along with levers, like moving a piano. Except the piano is angry and weighs as much as a bus. You can almost hear the rhythm, the thud of a wooden mallet, the creak of rope, the shouted timing that turns a crowd into a single organism. A careful reading might suggest that the miracle is not that stones moved, but that people agreed. That is a real power. You can have all the ropes in the world, but if half the village would rather stay home and argue about bread, the stone does not budge. So when you see a megalith, you may be seeing politics, belief, obligation, celebration, and yes, probably snacks. Because nothing says we are building a sacred monument like a giant communal meal afterward, where everyone pretends they did the hardest part. And now the mist. Because once you accept that humans can do astonishing things with simple tools, you still bump into patterns that tickle the imagination. Similar shapes, similar choices of location, similar attention to horizon lines and seasonal light. It's possible that some building traditions spread along trade routes or through intermarriage or through wandering craftspeople who carried tricks in their hands the way musicians carry songs. It's also possible that human minds facing the same constraints arrive at similar solutions without ever meeting. Both can be true in different places. Historians still argue whether similar megalithic features across distant regions point to contact between cultures or to independent invention. There's no full consensus, and that is okay. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Now here is where the question gets interesting without getting irresponsible. What if the stones are pointing at something else, not a single global empire with matching uniforms and a worldwide logo? Because that's the kind of tidy story reality rarely provides. But perhaps a smaller, stranger possibility. What if there were pockets of advanced know-how, local golden ages of engineering and organization that rose influenced neighbors and then faded, leaving behind the heavy parts that are hardest to erase? This might support the idea that what we call history is not a continuous movie, but a scrapbook with missing pages. Archaeology is wonderfully powerful, but it is also at the mercy of preservation. Wood rots, cloth vanishes, paper turns to dust. Even metal can corrode into silence. Stone, on the other hand, is stubborn. It is like that one friend who never leaves the party even when the music stops and the lights come on. A fringe idea proposes that some megaliths reflect a shared lost science, or a civilization that existed earlier than we think and got wiped away by catastrophe. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it fits the feeling you get when you stand beside an enormous stone and your inner voice whispers, "Are we sure we know the whole story?" If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood, a candlelight thought experiment, not a headline. And what about the erased part? The dramatic version is a sudden global flood or a single world-ending event that sweeps a civilization off the map overnight. A more cautious explanation could be slower and honestly more realistic. Climate shifts, earthquakes, drought, disease, migration, conflict, and the ordinary grinding of time. Sometimes history is not deleted with a bang. It is overwritten by new languages, new borders, and new priorities, until the old story becomes a rumor told around a fire. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Some clues are solid people built megaliths and they did it with human bodies and human brains. Some clues are suggestive, not conclusive patterns that invite the idea of shared knowledge or of forgotten techniques. And some clues are basically vibes, the cinematic, what if you feel in your chest when you stand in a shadow that should not still exist? You tilt your little brass compass again. The needle settles calm and certain, even when your thoughts are not. That's the balance we're keeping. Solid ground under your feet, mist in the air, no sprinting into the fog. So tonight you begin with a simple walk. You move from stone to stone in your mind, not leaping ahead to grand conclusions, but noticing. Size, fit, place, pattern. And you let yourself wonder softly, without panic, without certainty, the way you wonder at an old photograph where a stranger's face seems oddly familiar. Because if the world's megaliths are pointing anywhere, they might be pointing to this. Humans have always been capable of more than we assume, and the past is wider than our current map. To be clear, this is debated, and that's part of the comfort too. You do not have to solve it tonight. You only have to listen to the stones, feel the patience in their weight, and follow the thread one careful step at a time. You keep walking with that little brass compass warming in your palm, the fan hum still in your imagination like a soft engine. And the question becomes less cosmic and more practical, in the most soothing way possible. All right, then how do you actually move a stone that weighs more than your entire neighborhood's combined feelings? What's broadly accepted is that you do not need secret machines to move big stones, but you do need planning patience, and a lot of people who are willing to pull in the same direction without stopping to debate rope aesthetics. Archaeology suggests that ancient builders used a toolbox of simple physics leverage, friction management rollers, sledges, ramps, and the strategic use of gravity, which is the one worker on the team that never calls in sick. Most historians agree that the how changes from site to site based on terrain and materials. If you are near a river, water becomes your highway. If you are in a forested region, wood becomes your friend. Rollers, sled, runners, cribbing frames. If you are short on timber, you get creative with stone and earth. The evidence we do have points to methods that sound humble, ropes, posts, wedges, but scale up when you multiply them by coordination. A careful reading might suggest that the true technology is not a single device, but a system, small actions repeated with discipline until the impossible turns into, well, it took all summer, but it's over there now. You crouch beside the imagined route, tracing a line through dirt with your fingertip. The ground matters. A heavy load behaves like a stubborn animal. It chooses the easiest path, and if you insist on the hard path, it makes you pay for it in sweat. So, the mainstream picture starts with preparation. You level the track. You lay down logs or lubricated sled paths. You reinforce turns. You build temporary platforms like pauses in a long breath. This is the part documentaries sometimes skip because it looks like people doing chores, and chores are not cinematic, except, honestly, when the chore is move a mountain. One interpretation is that the most useful hack is reducing friction. A sledge sliding over wet clay water or oil can move heavier loads with fewer people. There is evidence from some ancient contexts, drawings, experiments, and traces of transport infrastructure that wetting sand or prepared surfaces can help. But let's keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The details vary, and not every site offers clear proof of exactly what was poured where. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Now you picture the rope, thick, coarse, the kind that bites your palms. You do not romanticize it too much because you have had a rope burn before, and it is not a personality trait. It is a lesson. Still, the rope is the line that turns a crowd into a machine. People pull in rhythm. Someone calls cadence. Someone watches the sledge's edge and shouts when it starts to drift. Someone is in charge of not letting the whole thing slide backward, which is a job description that basically reads, stand behind the giant stone and trust your life choices. And that's where leverage arrives, quiet and brilliant. Most historians agree that levers, long poles under a load, multiply human effort. You lift a fraction wedge, a stone under it, lift again, wedge again, and suddenly the boulder is higher without anyone needing superhero wrists. Archaeology suggests that cribbing stacking supports, as you inch a load upward, can create a controlled climb. It's slow, but it's safe. And if you are doing this for a sacred monument or an elite commission, slow is not a flaw. Slow is the point. Slow gives you time to sing, time to argue, time to make up with your cousin, time to become a community around the task. A more cautious explanation could be that many mysteries about transport come from forgetting the long timeline. We imagine a single heroic day, but building often happens over months or years. When you allow that the math changes, you can move a stone a short distance per day, stop, stabilize, move again, repeat. The stone does not care if you are dramatic about it. The stone is not impressed by your deadlines. Still, there are moments when the numbers feel like they glare back at you. This raises the possibility that small technical shortcuts mattered a lot better. Rope braiding, smarter sled, design, smoother paths, more efficient team organization. It's possible that knowledge traveled in fragments. Someone sees a technique at a gathering, remembers it, brings it home, and suddenly a whole region moves stones a little more confidently. A fringe idea proposes that ancient builders had lost devices, sound vibration, strange lifting tricks that made transport easy. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the main reason is simple. The evidence we do have points strongly to ordinary mechanics doing extraordinary work. But the rumor persists because people love an elegant solution, and also because they practiced for months and hauled it inch by inch is not as flashy as they hummed at it and it floated politely. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it stays in its proper place in the story mist, not on the solid ground. And there's another human factor that matters. The landscape itself sometimes helps. Gravity is a collaborator. If you can haul a stone to a ridge and then control its descent on rollers or a sledge, you let the earth do the heavy lifting, literally. That's a possibility, not a certainty for any given site, but it's a reminder that transport isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it's a dance with the terrain. You pause and listen for the smallest sounds, the imagined scrape of wood on packed soil, the squeak of a wet rope, the soft clack of a wedge being tapped into place. Sensory details are not proof, but they are a way of respecting the physical reality. Most historians agree that these projects were loud, dusty, and deeply tiring, and yet they were also social. There is often evidence of feasting and gathering around building events in various cultures, suggesting that monuments can be tied to community life as much as to rulers or ritual specialists. Translation: there is probably a snack schedule, and it is probably more organized than your current week. Historians still argue whether the most impressive megalithic moves required massive centralized control, or whether smaller communities working seasonally could achieve them through cooperation and time. Scholars continue to debate the balance between authority and voluntary participation, because human beings are complicated, and monument building is basically teamwork with consequences. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not claiming one universal method. We're following the simplest clues first. The evidence we do have points to multiple workable strategies, and it's possible that many sites used a mixed sledges on prepared tracks rollers, where wood was available, levers and cribbing for lifts, ramps for height water transport, where geography allowed. And now the calming part, when you accept the practicality, the stones become less supernatural and more intimate. You start to see fingerprints in the process, even if literal fingerprints are long gone. You see decisions where they chose to cut corners, where they refused. You see the difference between a rushed move and a careful one. You see where a team must have learned from mistakes because the path suddenly straightens, or the ground is reinforced, or the staging points appear like punctuation in the landscape. You roll the brass compass lid open and closed, once soft click, just to keep the mind from sprinting. The needle stays steady. The stone stays steady too, in its own way. And the mystery shifts, not toward impossible technology, but toward human organization. How did they persuade hundreds of people to commit to a project whose finish line might be years away? That question doesn't require a vanished super civilization to be interesting. It requires something both simpler and more impressive. Ordinary humans making a plan, repeating the plan, passing the plan down, until the plan becomes a monument. You keep moving and the stones start to feel less like isolated miracles and more like punctuation marks in a sentence written across the landscape. The brass compass is still in your hand, but now your eyes keep drifting upward because sooner or later, every big stone story bumps into the sky. Most historians agree that ancient communities watched the heavens for practical reasons, seasons planting migration weather patterns, and for symbolic reasons too, because the sky is the biggest calendar you will ever get, and it never runs out of pages. Archaeology suggests that many societies tracked solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles long before modern instruments using horizon points, notches in hills, sightlines between markers, and the slow confidence that comes from observing the same sunrise for decades. And you, in your quiet, second-person way, start doing the ancient thing. You line your body up with the horizon. You squint at where the sun falls. You imagine the year like a wheel, and you imagine people shaping stone to pin that wheel in place. What's broadly accepted is that some monumental sites show alignments that seem intentional. Sunrise at a certain time of year, a pathway pointing toward a notable horizon event, a doorway framing light like a ritual spotlight. But here's the soothing truth. Alignments can be tricky. The sky is predictable, but human interpretation is not always. Some alignments may be deliberate, some may be coincidental, and some may be the result of later changes to a structure. Because stone can be modified, added to, repaired, reused, and reimagined by people who come after. One interpretation is that repeated orientations across different monuments reflect shared ritual concerns, mark the turning of the year on our ancestors, synchronize communal gatherings. A careful reading might suggest that alignment is not only about astronomy, but about scheduling society itself. When a community agrees on a moment this day, this sunrise, this moon, it becomes a social glue. Everyone shows up, everyone eats, everyone remembers. And suddenly the monument is not just a pile of rock. It's a reminder that you belong to time together. Now you let the mist drift in gently, because this is where mystery likes to sit down and make itself comfortable. It's possible that certain patterns of orientation feel eerily similar across regions, because people shared ideas across trade routes, sea lanes, and long chains of contact. It's also possible that human brains everywhere look at the same sky and arrive at similar solutions. After all, if you want to find true north without a compass, you can do it by watching stars. If you want to mark the longest day, you can do it by noting where the sunrise reaches its farthest point along the horizon. These are accessible observations, not secret knowledge. But what if the story is pointing at something else? Not a single lost global school of astronomy with matching uniforms and a standardized exam. Please imagine the ancient proctor trying to confiscate stone tablets for cheating. It's adorable, but something more plausible, scattered traditions of sky watching shared in fragments. A traveler arrives and says, Back home, we gather when the sun rises there. Another community tries it. A builder hears that a certain star matters for navigation, and that star becomes sacred in a new place. Over generations, the sky lore migrates, like a melody changing key, but keeping a recognizable rhythm. The evidence we do have points to ancient navigation and seasonal tracking, especially along coasts and across familiar sea lanes. That might support the idea that some alignments are part of practical geography, a site oriented for wind protection, sunlight drainage visibility, or approach routes can accidentally align with a celestial event. This is why archaeologists tend to be cautious about declaring alignments as intentional, because you can make patterns from almost anything if you stare long enough. So, let's keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground people observed the sky and used it in their lives. Solid ground, some monuments appear to incorporate that observation. Missed the temptation to treat every alignment as a code, missed the urge to believe the stones are speaking in a universal language. A popular rumor claims that megalithic builders across the world knew advanced geometry and encoded it in their monuments as if the entire planet was participating in a single architectural conversation. This rumor is exciting, and sometimes it borrows real ingredients. Geometry exists, measurements exist, alignments exist, but it often leaps beyond what the evidence can support. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Geometry is common because it's useful. Right angles, circles, and repeated proportions appear naturally when people build with care. That's a possibility, not a certainty, for any grand unified plan. And yet, you stand there and you feel that familiar tug, the gentle itch of maybe. This is suggestive, not conclusive, when you find repeated attention to the horizon and the sky. You are seeing something human and enduring our desire to locate ourselves in time, to link daily life to cosmic rhythm, to say, we know when the world turns. That desire can make monuments feel like instruments, even if their music is ritual rather than scientific. You run your thumb along the edge of the compass lid again. Click. The sound is tiny compared to a stone block, and yet it's the same idea, a tool to orient your mind. In the ancient world, a monument can be a tool too. It can orient a community. Now imagine this. You are a person living thousands of years ago with no printed calendar, no phone reminders, and no neighbor texting. Hey, daylight saving time starts. The monument becomes your reminder, your seasonal alarm clock. When the sun hits that notch, you plant. When the shadow reaches that stone, you gather. When the moon rises where it should, you celebrate. And if you miss it, nobody sends you a push notification. They just quietly judge you while you try to look casual. Most historians agree that this kind of seasonal scheduling was crucial for agricultural societies. Archaeology suggests that ritual and practical timekeeping often blend because humans rarely separate useful from meaningful. And that blend can create the impression of mystery because it's not purely one thing or the other. It's both. Historians still argue whether the most famous alignments were engineered with precise astronomical intent or whether they emerged from broader cultural practices that only loosely tracked the sky. Scholars continue to debate how much precision ancient builders aimed for and whether later generations retrofitted meaning onto older structures. There's no full consensus, and again, that's part of the comfort. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So where does that leave your question about an erased civilization? A careful reading might suggest that erased does not have to mean mysteriously deleted. It could mean that knowledge moved in informal ways. Apprenticeships, seasonal gatherings, marriages, pilgrimages. so it did not leave a tidy library of written records. The evidence we do have points to many ancient societies transmitting complex knowledge orally and practically through doing. If that chain breaks, the technique can vanish quickly, even if the stones remain. And what if in a few places the chain broke more dramatically through disaster migration, or political collapse, and later builders inherited the monuments without fully inheriting the original intent? They repair them. They reuse them. They reinterpret them. They tell stories about giants, gods, or ancestors, because when you do not know the engineer, you invent the myth. That's not a certainty, it's a possibility, but it's a comforting one because it keeps the builders human and keeps the mystery alive. You take one last slow look at the horizon. The sky keeps its rhythm. The stones keep theirs. And you keep walking steady, not rushing, letting the next clue arrive as quietly as the sun sliding into place. You're still moving through the landscape in your mind, following stones, the way you'd follow lanterns on a dim path. And the mood shifts from big questions to close-up evidence, the kind you can almost feel under your fingertips. Because sooner or later, if you want to stay on solid ground, you have to kneel down and look at the surfaces, the cuts, the bruises, the scratches, the stubborn little signatures left behind by tools. Most historians agree that ancient stoneworking ranges from rough shaping to astonishingly fine finishing, depending on the purpose, the resources, and the skill available. Archaeology suggests that builders used stone hammers, copper, or bronze tools in some periods, harder stone pounders, abrasives like sand, and a whole lot of time. The evidence we do have points to processes that are less like one dramatic strike and more like 1,000 patient taps followed by scraping, grinding, and fitting, as if the stone is being persuaded rather than defeated. You crouch beside a block in your imagination and run your hand along it. The surface changes from textured and pitted to smoothed and intentional. Here you can sense the difference between a face that was meant to be seen and one that was meant to hide. A careful reading might suggest you're also seeing a worksite logic. Some faces are finished because they matter visually or structurally. Others are left rough because nobody will ever see them again once they're in the wall. That's mainstream ordinary human. It's also strangely calming, like noticing brushstrokes on a painting. Now the seams. What's broadly accepted is that tight-fitting joints can be achieved without modern machinery through repeated fitting and abrasion. You lift one stone, test it against another, mark the high spots, grind them down, test again. You do this until the stones settle together the way two tired people settle into the same couch, each finding the shape of the other. It takes time. It takes skill. It takes, honestly, a personality type that modern life rarely rewards: patient, meticulous, slightly obsessed, the kind of person who would absolutely spend 3 hours leveling a shelf and then stand back, like, yes, the universe is aligned now. Archaeology suggests that many cultures developed sophisticated masonry traditions independently because stone is everywhere and gravity never takes a day off. The evidence we do have points to a range of techniques: pecking and pounding with hammer stones, chiseling where metals allow, and polishing with abrasives. In some places, tool marks survive parallel grooves, pockmarks scuffed planes offering clues about the material used and the motion of the hand. But here's where your imagination starts to lean forward. One interpretation is that when you see unusual surfaces, certain smoothness, certain curves, certain melted looks, you might be looking at different finishing methods or later weathering, not necessarily lost technology. A more cautious explanation could be that water erosion, wind abrasion, salt temperature shifts, and centuries of human contact can soften edges and blur tool marks. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, it's possible that some sites show layers of work, an older, more eroded foundation, newer blocks above, repairs and additions, stones repurposed from earlier structures. This raises the possibility that what you're seeing is not a single build moment, but a long story of maintenance and reuse. That idea is mainstream friendly and also wonderfully mysterious, because it means a monument can be an inheritance passed down like a house you keep renovating, except the house is made of multi-ton blocks and nobody can find the original blueprint. A popular rumor claims that certain stones were cut with advanced machines or unknown techniques because the seams appear too precise. This rumor isn't new, and it thrives on the very human experience of looking at something impressive and assuming it must require technology like ours. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Precision is not exclusive to modernity. Humans have always been capable of exquisite craftsmanship when time training and motivation align. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's a strong reminder not to confuse "I can't picture how" them with "it couldn't be done." Now, you bring the brass compass close to the stone, not because it will do anything useful here, but because you like the ritual of it. Click. The lid opens. The needle steadies. You feel grounded again. Evidence first. What's broadly accepted is that quarries are part of the megalith story. The stones have to come from somewhere. Archaeology suggests that quarries can show tool marks, extraction trenches, unfinished blocks, and transport routes like the back rooms of the monument's story. The evidence we do have points to quarrying methods that are clever and physical, splitting stone with wedges, using water to expand wooden wedges, tapping along natural fracture lines, exploiting weaknesses in the rock. Sometimes the quarry itself becomes a kind of negative monument, a hollow where the stone used to be. One interpretation is that quarry choice reflects not just convenience, but cultural preference. Certain stone types matter aesthetically, ritually, or practically. A careful reading might suggest that the most important choice isn't the size of the block, but the consistency of the stone, how it behaves under stress, how it weathers, how it holds an edge. And in that choice, you can glimpse expertise that feels almost like Taste the Builder's palette for geology. Now for the mist, gently because it's going to show up anyway. A fringe idea proposes that ancient builders had lost methods for softening or molding stone because some surfaces look strangely fluid. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream archaeology tends to favor explanations involving known stoneworking abrasion and later weathering. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an atmospheric question. What if there were experimental techniques that didn't leave clear traces, or that were rare and localized? But again, the evidence is thin in most cases, and if it's thin, we'll say so. The more grounded mystery, the one that keeps you awake in a pleasant way, is how skill travels and disappears. The evidence we do have points to craft traditions being passed through apprenticeship and community knowledge. If a society collapses or shifts, those traditions can fade. The stones remain, but the hands that understood them are gone. Later, people may imitate the results without fully understanding the process, or they may decide the old way is too slow and choose different materials. Over generations, the how becomes a story rather than a method. Historians still argue whether certain monumental foundations represent the earliest phase of construction later built upon by different cultures, or whether the apparent differences in stonework can be explained by function material or changing labor conditions. Scholars continue to debate how to interpret layered masonry and mismatched styles because time leaves messy footprints. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is not a failure, it's the honest shape of the evidence. So you stay with the tactile reality. You imagine the sound of stone on stone, the gritty whisper of sand used as an abrasive, the dull thud of a hammerstone, the small shouts of workers communicating over noise. You picture a mason pausing, wiping dust off their face, studying a seam with the same intensity you study a crooked picture frame at someone else's house, polite on the outside, deeply upset on the inside. And then you step back and look at the wall as a whole, letting the close-up details fold into the bigger question again. What if the world's megaliths point to an erased civilization? Maybe the answer isn't a single erased empire, but a repeating cycle. Communities rise, master stone, and leave behind the hardest parts to remove. Later communities inherit those parts, reinterpret them, and sometimes build on top. The erasure is not total, it's selective. The soft evidence disappears. The hard evidence stays. You close the compass lid gently. Click. The wall stays, the seam stays, and you keep walking, ready for the next clue. You keep walking, and after all that close-up attention to seams and tool marks, your mind naturally wants a timeline. Not the tidy kind with neat arrows and confident labels, but the real kind where dates wobble a little, where layers overlap, and where the past occasionally clears its throat and says, actually, you thought this came later. That's when you arrive in your imagination at a hill that doesn't look like a revolution until you understand what's under the grass. Most historians agree that for a long time, the basic story went like this. Farming supports cities, cities support specialists, specialists support big monuments. Then archaeology suggests a more complicated reality because some monumental building appears startlingly early before the kind of urban life you picture when you hear the word civilization. The evidence we do have points to people gathering, organizing, and carving on a large scale in a period when the world was still mostly small groups, seasonal movement, and food that you actually have to chase, dig, or coax out of wild landscapes. One interpretation is that ritual cooperation may have helped create the conditions for settled life, rather than being a luxury that only appears after settlement. A careful reading might suggest that belief, social bonding, and shared identity can be as powerful as grain stores. In other words, people might gather first for meaning, then stay for practicality. And what if the first city is not streets and walls, but a calendar of gatherings, a place you return to because it holds your story? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So you stand on that hill in the cool night air, the fan hum still in the background of your mind, and you picture a time when there are no metal tools, like you'd recognize no carts with rubber tires, no cranes swinging politely, and yet there are pillars and carvings and plans. You imagine your fingertips brushing over incised animals, the lines sharp enough to feel intentional. Archaeology suggests that people at this time had the skill to quarry and shape stone with stone tools, and to organize labor in ways that leave lasting architecture behind. Here's the mainstream anchor that steadies you. It is broadly accepted that early monument building can predate or accompany early agriculture, and that human societies do not always evolve in a single straight line. The evidence we do have points to a lot of experimentation. People are trying new relationships with land, with plants, with animals, with each other. They are inventing new habits and then abandoning them, and then reinventing them again like humans do. You can almost hear someone in the distant past saying, "Okay, new plan." We try settling down, and someone else replying, "Great, but I'm still leaving if the mosquitoes get weird." One interpretation is that the act of building a shared, sacred place could motivate people to produce surplus coordinate schedules and strengthen alliances. A more cautious explanation could be that as environmental conditions change, people naturally cluster around reliable resources, and monuments emerge as part of that clustering. Either way, you're seeing organized behavior, not necessarily kings and bureaucracies, but social structures strong enough to gather labor. And now the mist moves in, because once you accept that monumental building can happen before cities feel normal, the imagination starts running. Its favorite question, then who taught who? A fringe idea proposes that such early complexity hints at an earlier, now lost tradition of knowledge, maybe even a vanished culture that passed down techniques like heirlooms, then disappeared. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it's important to say that. Mainstream archaeology can explain a lot through human innovation, gradual change, and local development. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a candlelit, what if the hilltop builders were inheriting more than they were inventing, not from a globe-spanning empire, but from older regional networks we can't fully see. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You take out the brass compass again, not because it will solve anything, but because you like the ritual of it. Click. The needle steadies, and you steady with it. Evidence first, wonder second. What's broadly accepted is that early monumental sites often sit within a wider landscape of smaller activities camps and tool-making, and that the monumental parts are only the most visible tip of the social iceberg. A careful reading might suggest that many of the people involved are not full-time builders, but seasonal participants showing up when food and time allow. That's a pleasant thought in a way. It means monument building can be a community event, not just an imposed burden. There's probably singing, there's probably arguing, there's definitely someone who says, "We should have started earlier in the day," as if that has ever helped anyone. Archaeology suggests that the carvings and imagery on early pillars can reflect symbolic worlds, animals, stories, perhaps identities, or clan markers. The evidence we do have points to a mind that is already rich with meaning. One interpretation is that such symbolism helps bind groups together, making cooperation possible beyond immediate kin. A more cautious explanation could be that the images reflect the environment and daily life, and that the meaning is partly lost to us. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now your attention shifts to a strangely practical detail that feels like it belongs in both worlds, mainstream and mysterious, intentional burial. Some early monumental sites appear to have been deliberately covered over at some point. The evidence we do have points to human choice in that act, not just accidental abandonment. Most historians agree that we should be careful with motives here, because covering something can mean many things: protection, closure, a ritual ending, a social change, even a practical way to stabilize a structure. But the human gesture of it is hard to ignore. It's like someone carefully putting away a cherished object, not because it's worthless, but because its season has passed. A popular rumor claims that intentional burial means someone was hiding forbidden knowledge or sealing away a dangerous secret. This rumor is dramatic, and drama is very good at getting invited to the party even when nobody asked. Let me rephrase that more carefully intentional burial can be meaningful without being conspiratorial. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's the calmer way to hold it. And still, the cinematic what if is irresistible. What if the site is being archived like a chapter being closed so the next chapter can begin? What if people are protecting something they respect even as their way of life changes around it? What if you are standing at the hinge of a cultural transition where the old gathering rhythms give way to new settled rhythms and the monument becomes a memory? You literally cover the way you might tuck in a sleeping child. Historians still argue whether the rise of early monumental building drove social complexity or whether growing social complexity naturally produced monuments as a byproduct. Scholars continue to debate cause and effect because the past doesn't hand you a neat flowchart. There's no full consensus, and that is part of the honest beauty here. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. So, what does this do to your big question about a civilization erased from history? It nudges you toward a more nuanced possibility. Maybe the erased civilization is not a single lost superpower. Maybe it's a set of early traditions that don't fit the old story traditions that flourished briefly, then got folded into new ways of living. Their names vanish. Their languages vanish. Their wood and fiber and skin clothing vanish. But their stones remain because stone is stubborn and sentimental. One interpretation is that later societies might look back at these early monuments as relics of ancestors or mythic builders, reusing the spaces, reinterpreting the symbols, and layering new meaning onto old stone. A more cautious explanation could be that continuity is messy with breaks and returns. Either way, you can imagine people in later generations arriving at the hilltop and feeling the same thing you feel now, the uneasy awe of standing somewhere that seems older than the story you were told. You close the compass lid again. Click. The hill remains quiet. The carvings remain. And you keep walking, carrying a calmer, stranger timeline in your pocket, one where monuments can come early, where communities can organize before cities, and where the first great structures might be less about rulers and more about gathering, remembering, and the human need to make time visible in stone. You keep that thought of early gathering places tucked behind your ribs and your feet. Your imagined feet carry you toward an island where the wind never seems to fully stop talking. The air tastes faintly of salt, and the ground feels like it's been baked and cooled and baked again, as if the land itself is a kiln. Out on the slopes, stone figures wait with their backs to the sea, faces turned inland, watching a place that is both home and question. Most historians agree that the Moai of Rapa Nui are deeply connected to ancestry, community identity, and social power, and archaeology suggests they were carved by local people from volcanic tuff, then transported and raised in ways that demanded planning, labor, and tradition. The evidence we do have points to a society that invested enormous energy into making memory visible, turning lineage and status into silhouettes you can see from far away, like a family portrait the size of a building. You stand near one in your mind and do that inevitable human thing. You look up and think, okay, but how? Not because the mainstream explanation isn't credible, but because your muscles can't help imagining the weight. The stone is quiet, but your body is loud with questions. What's broadly accepted is that many Moai were carved at a quarry and then moved across the island to ceremonial platforms. Archaeology suggests that the process involved teams rope leverage and a strong understanding of balance and friction. The evidence we do have points to practical experimentation, people trying methods, refining them, passing them down. Because if you get it wrong, a statue doesn't just oops in a cute way. It oops in a way that becomes a permanent, boulder-shaped regret. One interpretation is that the moai are not just art objects, but social engines. Carving, transporting, and raising them could strengthen alliances, enforce leadership, and create shared purpose. A careful reading might suggest that the effort itself is part of the meaning. If it takes a village to raise an ancestor, then the village becomes a village in the raising. And now the story miss creeps in because Rapa Nui comes with a famous persistent bit of wonder. A popular rumor claims the statues walked to their platforms, moved upright, swaying side to side as if taking steps. This rumor feels like myth, but it also overlaps with a practical possibility. Some experiments have shown that with ropes and coordinated pulling, an upright statue shape might be rocked forward in controlled increments. This theory isn't widely accepted as the universal method for all moai, but it's suggestive, not conclusive, and it's a perfect example of what we're doing tonight. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a beautiful image that still respects human hands and simple physics. You can almost hear it, rope fibers tightening, people calling rhythm, the statue's base scraping and then settling, scraping and settling like a refrigerator being moved across a kitchen floor while someone insists, no, it's fine. We don't need to measure the doorway. That person exists in every century. They are immortal. The evidence we do have points to multiple proposed transport methods. Sledges, rollers, dragging, rocking, each with strengths and weaknesses depending on terrain and statue shape. A more cautious explanation could be that different groups use different methods at different times, and that later stories preserve the feel of the movement upright, swaying more than the mechanics. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it's exactly the kind of ambiguity that keeps the mystery gentle rather than misleading. Now, when people talk about Rapa Nui, they often drift into another big, emotionally charged story, environmental change, and social strain. Most historians agree that the island's history includes complex shifts in resources, land use, and social organization over time, and archaeology suggests that environmental pressure can interact with cultural practices in ways that are hard to untangle neatly. The evidence we do have points to a society adapting under constraints, with debates about timelines, causes, and how dramatic the changes were. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The popular one simple collapse story is tempting, but the past usually refuses to be that tidy. Historians still argue whether deforestation and ecological stress were the primary drivers of major social change on Rapa Nui, or whether factors like climate variability, introduced species disease, and later outside contact played equally important roles. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters because it reminds you how easily a complex human story gets flattened into a moral poster. And that connects softly, responsibly to your big question about a civilization erased from history. Because erased does not have to mean mysteriously deleted by one gigantic event. Sometimes erasure is the slow fading of context. The statues remain, but the daily routines that made them normal are gone. The quarry remains, but the jokes the workers told while carving are gone. The rope-making techniques, the songs for pulling the arguments about who gets the next statue gone. Stone outlasts voice. One interpretation is that megaliths function as cultural anchors, and when the anchoring culture changes or is disrupted, outsiders or even later descendants can misread what they see. A fringe idea proposes that the moai are evidence of a lost external influence, visitors from elsewhere. teaching monumental carving, then vanishing. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the mainstream evidence strongly supports local origin and development. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it tells you something real about human psychology. When we encounter extraordinary craftsmanship, we sometimes struggle to credit ordinary people living in extraordinary conditions. Archaeology suggests we should start with what's broadly accepted. Communities innovate where they are using what they have, because necessity is a very persuasive teacher. The evidence we do have points to local quarrying, local carving, local transport challenges solved locally, and still the island's remoteness adds a cinematic what-if mood note you can't quite shake. What if the ocean carried not only fish and storms, but ideas, small sparks of technique passed along by rare contacts? This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it's enough to let your imagination sit in the moonlight without running into the fog. Now you walk past toppled statues. In your mind, some fallen long ago, some perhaps toppled during social conflict, some likely damaged by time and weather. You don't treat it as a horror scene. It's quiet. It's the kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing. The Moai are not shouting a single message. They are holding a question. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the question they hold feels familiar. Now, what does it mean when a culture can move mountains and then later cannot or chooses not to? Because cannot and choose not to can look identical from far away. A careful reading might suggest that the end of monument building doesn't always mean the end of capability. Sometimes it means priorities change, beliefs shift, power structures reorganize, or resources become too precious to spend on stone. In other words, the loss might be cultural, not technical. You let the brass compass sit heavy in your pocket again, like a small reminder to stay honest. The needle doesn't point to a vanished empire. It points to direction, not destiny. So what if the world's megaliths point to a civilization erased from history? Rapa Nui offers a calmer, more human version of that idea. The erasure might be the missing context around the stones, the living knowledge that doesn't fossilize. The statues remain like silhouettes at dusk, and you, half awake, can mistake a silhouette for anything you want: giants, gods, outsiders, secrets. But the evidence we do have points to people local, inventive, social, stubborn, solving problems with rope leverage and belief. And the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm: the exact steps, the exact songs, the exact decisions that turned rock into ancestor and ancestor into landscape. You take one more slow look at the inland gaze of the statues and let the ocean wind lull the edges of your thoughts. Then you keep walking because the next stones are waiting and the night is still gentle enough to hold another question. You leave the island wind behind, but you keep its sound in your head because it blends nicely with the fan hum, like the world is softly shushing you towards sleep. Your path now feels colder, greener, and damp in that familiar way where the ground seems to exhale moss. You are on open land where the sky is wide and low, and you can smell wet earth and crushed grass. Ahead, stones stand in a circle, and you feel the strange comfort of geometry outdoors, like someone tried to domesticate the horizon. Most historians agree that Stonehenge was constructed in multiple phases over a long period, and archaeology suggests it functioned within a wider, ceremonial landscape of monuments, burials, and pathways. The evidence we do have points to communities investing time and labor in a place that is not useful in the everyday sense, but is deeply useful in the social sense. It gathers people, focuses meaning, and turns land into memory. You step closer in your mind and do that modern thing where you want the monument to be a single noun, a temple, a calendar, a cemetery, a palace. But Stonehenge stubbornly refuses to be just one thing, because human places rarely are. What's broadly accepted is that it likely served different roles across different phases: ritual gatherings, symbolic marking of time, connection to ancestors, perhaps healing traditions, or social diplomacy. A careful reading might suggest that part of its power comes from its flexibility, its ability to be a stage for whatever the society needs at a given moment. Archaeology suggests that massive stones were transported from considerable distances, including smaller bluestones, often associated with whales, and larger sarcens from more local sources. The evidence we do have points to human movement, human planning, and human stubbornness. Because if you've ever tried to organize a group project, moving stones is probably easier than moving opinions. One interpretation is that the act of hauling stones is itself a social machine. It creates alliances, obligations, and shared stories. Another interpretation is that the monument's design could be a kind of social script, guiding people through space, approach, routes, processions, gathering points, turning a crowd into a ritual. And what if the real technology here is choreography, not machinery? The ability to stage community in a way that feels bigger than any one person. Now let's keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground Stonehenge was built in phases, and evidence indicates long-term planning and ritual significance. Solid ground. The broader landscape includes other monuments, and the place is part of a network, not a solitary marvel. Mist the temptation to claim it is a precision machine built by a single secret group with a single secret purpose that everyone conveniently forgot. Human beings, bless them, are not that tidy. A popular rumor claims Stonehenge was built by outsiders or by a lost race with advanced knowledge. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and mainstream archaeology points strongly to local and regional communities shaping it over time within known cultural contexts. But the rumor persists because Stonehenge feels like a statement, and statements invite dramatic authorship. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood. What if the place is older in spirit than its stones? What if it sits on a tradition of sacred gathering that predates the visible phases? That's the kind of mystery that doesn't require magic. It requires time. Now your attention shifts from the stones themselves to the invisible architecture, the way people moved around them. Archaeology suggests processional avenues and alignments that may connect to seasonal events like solstices. The evidence we do have points to gatherings at specific times of year when the sky does its predictable turning and humans do their predictable gathering. Most historians agree that seasonal festivals and communal rites are common in many societies, and big monuments often serve as anchors for them. And here's a more playful thought, because every 1,000 words needs a little gentle humor, so your brain doesn't get too serious and start filing paperwork. Imagine being the person who shows up late on solstice morning. Everyone is already in position, watching the horizon, and you come jogging in like, sorry, traffic, as if there were Neolithic traffic. The reality check is you probably won't survive that kind of social embarrassment. That's the real ancient danger. Not lions, not storms, just the quiet judgment of a community that woke up early. One interpretation is that monuments like Stonehenge functioned as treaty spaces, neutral grounds where different groups could meet, exchange goods, arrange marriages, settle disputes, and perform shared rituals. A careful reading might suggest that the monument's permanence gives it authority. It outlasts individual leaders, so it can represent continuity. That might support the idea that the stones are less about one ruler's ego and more about community cohesion over generations. Historians still argue whether Stonehenge's primary purpose was astronomical, funerary, political, or a multifunctional, and scholars continue to debate how those roles shifted across phases. There's no full consensus, and the honest answer is probably yes, in the sense that human places do multiple jobs. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm: the precise rituals, the spoken meanings, the personal reasons people cared enough to keep building. Now you feel your big question returning in a new form. What if the world's megaliths point to a civilization erased from history? Stonehenge whispers a calmer possibility. The erasure might be cultural, not structural. The stones remain, but the social technology, the agreements, the ritual scripts, the reasons fade. A fringe idea proposes that widespread megalith building hints at a hidden network of knowledge shared across regions, maybe seafaring contacts or traveling specialists who carried techniques like a toolkit of traditions. This theory isn't widely accepted as a single global system, but it's possible that smaller networks existed. The evidence we do have points to long-distance movement of materials and people in prehistoric Europe, suggesting that communities were not isolated bubbles. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a plausible mist ideas traveling like smoke on wind, sometimes visible, sometimes gone. And what if the lost civilization is not a single empire, but a lost way of coordinating an ancient habit of gathering at certain places and times, building in stone, because stone outlasts voices? When that habit breaks, the places remain like empty stages. Later people arrive and invent new plays on the same stage. The old play is erased not by fire, but by forgetfulness. You walk the circle slowly. You let the stones cast long shadows. You listen to the imagined murmur of a crowd that isn't there. You picture the smell of smoke from hearths, the warmth of bodies gathered in cold air, the taste of simple food shared under a wide sky. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And you keep your compass close because it reminds you to stay honest, direction, not destiny. Stonehenge does not demand that you believe in a hidden truth. It invites you to sit with a puzzle. It invites you to accept that human societies can do extraordinary things, and that meaning can vanish even when stone remains. The circle holds your gaze for a moment longer, then releases it. And you keep walking because there are other stones in other climates waiting to tell you their version of the same quiet question. You leave the damp grass and the wide English sky behind, but you keep the feeling of standing inside a circle protected by geometry because it makes the rest of the night feel gentler. The fan hum stays steady. The brass compass rests in your palm like a small promise that we won't sprint into fantasy. And yet, as you keep walking through this global gallery of stone, you start noticing a particular kind of mystery that doesn't need any dramatic music: the joint, the seam, the place where two giant pieces of reality decide to cooperate. Most historians agree that tight-fitting masonry can be achieved through careful shaping, repeated testing, and patient abrasion, and archaeology suggests that many cultures developed high-precision stonework, using methods that are slow but effective. The evidence we do have points to craft traditions, trained hands, learned eyes, and the willingness to do the same motion 1,000 times until the surface behaves. Still, you know the feeling. You stand in front of a wall where blocks weigh tons, and the seams look like they were drawn with a razor. You can't help thinking, Is this just skill, or is there something else in the story? One interpretation is that the impossible fit is often a survival strategy. A careful reading might suggest that in earthquake-prone regions, or in places where walls need to resist, shifting tightly interlocked stones can perform better than rough stacking. It's possible that precision is less about showing off and more about engineering resilience. In other words, the wall isn't bragging, it's bracing. What's broadly accepted is that builders can use simple tools, straight edges, plumb lines, water levels, measuring chords to achieve surprising accuracy. Archaeology suggests that even without modern metal rulers, people can develop consistent units and practical geometry through repeated work. The evidence we do have points to measuring as a craft. You don't need a printed textbook to discover that a taut chord makes a straight line, or that a triangle can help you keep angles true. You need time. You need repetition. You need a builder who gets visibly irritated when something is slightly off. And if you've ever watched someone obsessively align tiles in a bathroom, you already understand the mindset. Now multiply that mindset by a culture that thinks this wall is sacred, political, or eternal, and you get a seam that makes modern tourists whisper like they're in a museum because they are. Now the myth shows up with its usual party trick. A popular rumor claims that certain precision joints could only be made with advanced machinery, lost tools, or even techniques that soften stone. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and mainstream explanations usually involve known methods: pecking, grinding, abrasive sanding, repeated fitting, and careful planning. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When you see an extraordinary seam, the safest assumption is extraordinary patience before extraordinary technology. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it keeps you on solid ground. And yet the rumor persists because it's emotionally satisfying. It's tidy. It says, here is the missing key. But the past rarely hands you a single key. It hands you a ring of keys, and half of them are unlabeled, and one of them is just decorative, and you have to try them all. So you do the calm thing, you look for context. The evidence we do have points to different grades of stonework within the same complex. Some areas finished beautifully, some rough, some built quickly, some built with care. A careful reading might suggest that labor conditions and purpose change over time. A defensive wall might require speed. A ceremonial facade might require perfection. Repairs might use whatever stone is available. New rulers might rebuild old foundations. In that layering, you can get the impression of a mismatch. This part looks older. This part looks better. This part looks like someone was in a hurry. And that impression can feed the erased civilization feeling, because it seems like different hands from different eras are talking over each other. It's possible that some monuments incorporate older stones or sit atop older structures that are no longer visible. This raises the possibility that later builders inherited foundations that were already impressive and decided to build upon them rather than start from scratch. That does not require a hidden global civilization. It requires a very normal human decision. Reuse what works, honor what's old, save time, borrow authority. Most historians agree that reuse and rebuilding are common across history, and archaeology suggests that many monumental sites are palimpsest layers of construction, destruction, repair, and reinterpretation. The evidence we do have points to this being a major reason the past can feel confusing. You are not looking at one moment frozen in time. You are looking at many moments stacked like stones. And here comes your debate cue right on schedule, because we promised. Historians still argue whether the most impressive foundational masonry in some complexes represents an earlier phase by a distinct group later built upon, or whether differences in style and precision can be explained by function, material properties, and evolving craftsmanship within the same tradition. Scholars continue to debate how to read seams between eras, because later builders can imitate earlier styles and earlier builders can experiment, and weather can blur everything like a soft focus filter you never asked for. Now let's take a short detour into something that feels small but matters: the idea of standards. One interpretation is that precision stonework suggests not only skilled individuals, but organized training, guild-like transmission of technique, even if we don't use that exact word for every culture. A careful reading might suggest that builders develop rules of thumb that become formal over generations: how to check flatness, how to set a line, how to distribute weight, how to avoid cracking. These rules can travel with people. Apprentices move, marriages connect regions, traders carry ideas, and suddenly a technique appears in a new place, not because of a secret civilization, but because humans are mobile and curious. A fringe idea proposes that a more unified network existed where master builders traveled widely, sharing a hidden curriculum of stone. This theory isn't widely accepted as a global system, but it's possible that regional networks existed. The evidence we do have points to long-distance contact in many eras, even when records are scarce, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. It adds a gentle, cinematic what-if note. What if some of the similarities you notice are the fingerprints of travel techniques, hopping from coast to coast like a whispered recipe? Now let's ground again in the tactile. You imagine the mason at work. They lift a block with levers and ropes, they set it down. It doesn't fit, they mark it with pigment or charcoal. They pull it back out. They grind the high spots with abrasive stone and sand. They test again. This cycle can happen countless times. It's slow, it's frustrating. It is also how you get a seam so tight you can't slide a blade through. And the best part, sleepwise, is that the method is repetitive, rhythmic, almost meditative. You can fall asleep just thinking about it, like watching someone sand wood until it turns silky. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So, what does the seam mystery do for your erased civilization question? It gives you a quieter version of the possibility. Maybe what was erased was not a superpower, but a craft tradition, a body of practical knowledge that lived in hands and habits more than in texts. When that tradition breaks later, builders might still be competent, but they may not prioritize the same precision, or they may not have the same apprenticeship chain, or they may not have the same social motivation to spend years perfecting a hidden joint. Over time, the older work looks impossible, not because it was impossible, but because it belonged to a different cultural rhythm. You roll the brass compass between your fingers. The needle settles again. You take a slow breath. The stones don't demand that you choose between human skill and mystery. They invite you to hold both the solid ground of known methods and the mist of lost context. And you keep walking because now the path turns toward a place where stones are not just fitted, they're interlocked like a puzzle built to resist the trembling of the earth. You turn that last thought over. Walls built not just to stand, but to survive shaking. And your imagined path lifts into high air. The fan hum becomes a mountain wind in your ears. You taste thin cold on your tongue, and you smell sun-warmed stone that cools fast when the light slips away. Below you a valley opens like a bowl, and above you blocks rise in a jagged rhythm that feels almost alive. The shapes aren't neat rectangles. They're polygons, many-sided stones fitted together like an intentional riddle. Most historians agree that Andean societies developed remarkable stoneworking and construction traditions, and archaeology suggests that polygonal masonry can be both practical and symbolic, especially in regions where earthquakes are a fact of life. The evidence we do have points to patient shaping and repeated fitting that allows walls to flex and settle without collapsing, a kind of stone choreography where each block knows its role. You stand before the wall in your imagination and feel immediately why tourists go quiet. The stones look like they're holding hands. Not romantically, more like a firm professional handshake between colleagues who respect each other's boundaries. Each joint is irregular, yet precise. Each block seems to lock into the next. And the more you look, the more you realize this isn't random, it's controlled complexity. What's broadly accepted is that polygonal masonry can improve stability because the interlocking shapes reduce the chance of sliding along a single straight seam. A careful reading might suggest that what looks like artistry is also engineering design choices that anticipate stress. It's possible that builders learned through experience. Walls crack, walls fall. And then someone says quietly, "All right, new rule, no long straight joints." Archaeology suggests that Andean builders used stone hammers, harder, stone pounders, and abrasives to shape blocks, along with levers, ramps, and coordinated labor to set them in place. The evidence we do have points to a process that is slow and iterative: fit, mark, remove, grind, fit again. That loop becomes the heartbeat of the wall. You can almost hear it like a patient drum. One interpretation is that polygonal styles reflect a shared training tradition, builders learning a visual language of joints and angles passed down through apprenticeship. A more cautious explanation could be that local stone type and seismic conditions naturally encourage this style, and different regions arrive at similar solutions because the earth teaches the same lesson: wobble-proof your work. Either way, the wall becomes a statement of adaptation, not mystery tech. And now the mist arrives, because it always does when the stones look like puzzles. A popular rumor claims that these walls are so precise they must have been built with lost machines, lasers, or techniques beyond ordinary tools. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and mainstream explanations, time skill, and iterative fitting account for a great deal. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Hard to imagine is not the same as impossible. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's the safest mental habit you can carry into this topic. Still, there are features that invite wonder even when you stay responsible. You might see stones with multiple faces meeting perfectly. You might notice slight inward tilts, subtle curves, or the way a wall seems to hug its own weight. It's possible that builders developed sophisticated rules of thumb for managing load and stress, practical geometry learned in the field, not necessarily written down. And here's a gentle joke to keep your brain from turning this into a courtroom. Imagine trying to explain polygonal masonry to a modern contractor who insists everything needs to be standardized. You show them a wall of interlocking stones shaped like irregular stars, and they stare at you like you're speaking whale. So, which one is the 2x4, they ask? And you just point at a 10-ton block and say, "That one. It's a 2x4 emotionally." You probably won't survive that conversation, but you will sleep better knowing ancient builders weren't limited by modern hardware store categories. Now back to the grounded story. Most historians agree that monumental Andean sites were built within complex social systems involving labor organization, ritual, and political authority, and archaeology suggests that state and community labor could mobilize large workforces for construction. The evidence we do have points to skilled specialists, but also to broad participation people, contributing time as part of obligation identity or communal practice. One interpretation is that the most impressive masonry represents elite or ceremonial priorities, places where the highest skill is concentrated because the symbol matters. A more cautious explanation could be that different work teams had different skill levels, and you can sometimes see that in the stonework, some sections are astonishing, some are simpler, some are repairs. That layering is important because it means different styles do not automatically imply different civilizations. They can imply different moments, different purposes, different budgets. Yes, ancient budgets existed just in the form of grain and labor and political goodwill. Historians still argue whether certain foundational walls in Andean complexes represent earlier phases that later builders incorporated, or whether they were built as part of a single broader tradition with internal variation and long development. Scholars continue to debate the sequence in specific sites because dating stone is difficult and later rebuilding can blur lines. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is where the mystery lives without turning into misinformation. Now let's connect this back to your erased civilization question in a way that keeps the 70-30 balance honest. If you want a mainstream friendly explanation for why polygonal masonry can feel like it's from another world, it might be this craft knowledge can peak then shift. The evidence we do have points to society's changing priorities, new rulers, new religions, new materials, new building styles. A careful reading might suggest that later builders sometimes choose speed scale or different aesthetics over painstaking fit. Not because they can't do it necessarily, but because they don't want to invest that kind of time, or they have different pressures. Over centuries, that shift can make older work look impossible, like a forgotten dialect. And now the mist gently, what if some of those peaks of craft are echoes of older practices inherited from predecessors whose names didn't survive? Not a globe-spanning vanished empire, but a local lineage of builders, masters, and apprentices whose techniques were carried forward like family recipes. If the chain breaks, the recipe fades. The stones remain, and later people tell stories, giants, gods, ancient teachers. A fringe idea proposes that a much older, lost culture laid the earliest foundations and later Andean societies simply built on top. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream archaeology emphasizes local development and human capability. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic, what if you can hold lightly? What if the oldest stones in some places are the last visible page of a chapter we can't fully read? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you stand there and listen to the mountain air. You imagine a tremor passing through the ground, not as a scary scene, but as a reminder that this landscape moves. You feel the quiet genius of building with motion in mind. You picture stones settling, not cracking, as if the wall is breathing with the earth. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You roll your brass compass between your fingers again. It's comforting to remember direction is not proof, it's guidance. And the guidance here is simple. When you see polygonal stonework that looks too perfect, start with the human story tools, training time, earthquakes, and the stubborn desire to make something that lasts. Then if you still want to wonder softly. What if the techniques are older than the names we remember? What if the craft traveled farther than we can trace? What if the walls are not hiding a single truth, but holding a layered history, human hands on human hands, generation after generation, until the wall becomes a fossil of skill? And you keep walking, because the next part of the story is not about how stones fit together. It's about how the world forgets and how it remembers when water rises, when earth shakes, and when time quietly takes its scissors to the record. You leave the mountain air behind, but you take something with you, an image of stones built to move with the earth rather than fight it. That idea settles into your chest like a slow, steady breath. And now, as you keep walking through this nighttime atlas of megaliths, the question shifts from how were these built to how could so much be forgotten? Because forgetting when you really think about it is the most human technology of all. Most historians agree that major environmental changes and natural disasters have repeatedly shaped human settlement, and memory and archaeology suggests that floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, droughts, and sea level changes can disrupt societies, force migration, and bury or erode evidence. The evidence we do have points to history being unevenly preserved. Some regions keep their stories in stone and clay, while others lose them to water rot and shifting ground. You stand on a shoreline in your imagination, where the sand is cool and the tide is halfway in, and you picture the coastline not as fixed, but as a slow-moving line that has wandered over thousands of years. What's broadly accepted is that sea levels rose significantly after the last ice age, and that ancient coastlines now lie underwater in many places. Archaeology suggests this means some early settlements, ports, and activity zones could be submerged, making them harder to find and study. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth. If people once lived where the water is now, their wooden houses and woven nets and everyday tools don't have an easy time surviving. One interpretation is that some of the missing chapters in human history might simply be missing because they are underwater, buried, or eroded, not because they were hidden, but because nature is an aggressive editor. A more cautious explanation could be that while submergence explains some gaps, it doesn't automatically imply lost high civilization. It suggests lost evidence of ordinary life, which can still be significant. And what if the erasure you're feeling in these megalith stories is not a single erased empire, but 1,000 erased shorelines where people lived, worked, and traded before the sea quietly moved the boundary? Now, the mist rolls in because once water enters the story, big myths tend to follow. A popular rumor claims that a single catastrophic flood wiped out a global civilization, and that surviving megaliths are remnants left on higher ground. This rumor is emotionally powerful, simple cause, dramatic effect, but it isn't widely accepted in that global one-event form. Let me rephrase that more carefully. There is solid evidence for many regional floods and for large post-ice age sea level rise, but connecting that to one worldwide lost civilization is a bigger leap than the evidence usually supports. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic what if rather than a historical claim. And honestly, the cinematic version is still worth visiting gently because it helps you feel the vulnerability of memory. You imagine a coastal community watching water take the familiar landmarks. You imagine them moving inland, carrying only what they can. Their buildings are wood and reed. Their stories live in voice. Their archives are in routines. In a generation or two, the shoreline of their childhood becomes a legend. The evidence we do have points to how quickly oral memory can shift in detail even while retaining emotional truth. A careful reading might suggest that myth can preserve the shape of loss, water darkness, relocation, even if it doesn't preserve a date or a map. Now widen the lens beyond water. Earth shakes. Fire falls from the sky in the form of ash. Rivers change course. Forests advance. Deserts spread. Archaeology suggests that these shifts can force societies to adapt or move, sometimes leaving behind monumental sites that later appear mysterious because the cultural continuity broke. The evidence we do have points to the past being full of local disruptions, not one single clean apocalypse. One interpretation is that megaliths survive precisely because they are made of the least erasable material. A careful reading might suggest that if you want to imagine an erased civilization, you should picture not glittering towers and metal machines, but communities whose most durable legacy is stone platforms, walls, circles, carved blocks, while everything else is vulnerable. That might support the idea that what remains feels like the tip of an iceberg. And what if you were walking across the tips of many icebergs scattered through time, each one hinting at the bulk of daily life that melted away? Now here is where the skepticism stays cozy. Because iceberg thinking can be true without becoming wild. The past is incomplete. That's mainstream. The record is patchy. That's mainstream. The temptation is to fill the missing bulk with a single grand story. That's where we have to be careful. Historians still argue whether abrupt cultural changes in various regions are best explained by environmental pressure, social conflict, economic shifts, outside contact, or some combination, because the same outcome, abandonment, migration, collapse, can have many causes. Scholars continue to debate how much weight to give to climate versus politics versus chance, and there's no full consensus. And that uncertainty is not a flaw, it's the honest silhouette of the past. Now the brass compass comes back into the story as more than a cute prop. You flip it open. Click. The needle settles. It reminds you. Even if the landscape changes, direction is a relationship between you and the world. The past had directions too. Trade routes, seasonal migrations, paths between valleys, coast to inland corridors. Archaeology suggests that people moved along these routes for thousands of years, sharing good spouses and ideas. One interpretation is that megalithic styles could spread through these movements in small ways. A construction idea here, a ritual practice there, a way of marking time or honoring ancestors. A more cautious explanation could be that similar human needs create similar monuments independently. Both can happen. And what if the feeling of a global pattern comes not from a single civilization, but from the shared logic of being human? You want to remember, you want to gather, you want to make something that outlasts you. A fringe idea proposes that a network of advanced seafarers once linked distant coasts and transmitted megalith-building knowledge before being erased by rising seas. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is often too thin to support sweeping conclusions. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a gentle mist. What if there were more connections than we can currently trace, and the sea simply took the receipts? And that leads to the calmest version of your erased civilization idea. Not a dramatic Atlantis with matching uniforms, but a lost archive of human experience. Skills that were never written down, routes that shifted, settlements now underwater, languages that dissolved. The stones remain because they're heavy enough to resist the editor's pen. You walk along the shoreline in your mind and feel the tide breathing in and out. You imagine the water as a librarian that doesn't mean to be cruel, but inevitably misplaces things. It doesn't hate history. It just doesn't care. That's the reality check. And you probably won't survive trying to argue with the ocean about it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So, by the end of this section, you're holding a clearer, calmer frame Megaliths might point to erasure, not because someone hid a secret, but because nature and time are exceptionally good at removing everything except the hardest parts. What remains can feel like a code, but it might simply be what survived. You close the compass lid softly. Click. The tide continues. The stones wait on higher ground, and you keep walking toward the next clue, the one that doesn't live in water or joints, but in the lines that connect stones across continents. Trade routes, sea lanes, and cultural echoes that drift like smoke, sometimes visible, sometimes gone. You keep walking with the shoreline sound still in your ears and the fan hum behind it, like the world has a built-in white noise machine just for you. The brass compass sits warm in your hand, and now it feels less like a cute prop and more like the theme of the night direction. Because once you accept that water and time erase evidence, the next question becomes softer and more intriguing. How did ideas travel before anyone could write ASAP on anything? Most historians agree that ancient peoples traded and traveled farther than earlier generations of scholars sometimes assumed, and archaeology suggests that networks of exchange by river coastline and overland routes connected communities across surprising distances. The evidence we do have points to long-distance movement of materials like obsidian shells, metals, and distinctive stones, along with shared motifs and technologies that appear in different regions. In other words, the ancient world is not a set of sealed jars. It's a set of jars with lids that never quite fit, and things keep sloshing between them. You picture yourself on a coastal path at dusk. The air smells like salt and smoke. Somewhere behind you, someone is drying fish. Somewhere ahead, someone is making a fire and telling a story that includes the exact same joke your people tell, only with different names. That's how exchange works. It's not always obvious. It's not always recorded, but it leaves echoes. What's broadly accepted is that seafaring and coastal travel can be efficient compared to dense inland terrain, and archaeology suggests that boats ranging from simple rafts to more advanced craft, depending on region and era, enabled movement of people and goods. The evidence we do have points to the ocean as both barrier and highway. And if you've ever tried to carry heavy supplies over mountains, you already understand why water routes are so attractive. Even the ancient world knew, if you can float it, float it. One interpretation is that megalith building ideas could spread like practical folklore. Someone sees a ritual platform in a distant village and brings the concept home. Someone learns a rope trick, a wedge method, a way of setting stones that reduces cracking, and suddenly that technique shows up in a new place. A careful reading might suggest that you don't need a global empire for this. You need curiosity, contact, and time. And what if the global feeling of megaliths is really the product of countless small exchanges, tiny sparks traveling along routes we only partly understand? Now let's keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground trade networks existed, sometimes quite extensive. Solid ground ideas and materials moved. Missed the temptation to imagine a single master blueprint shipped worldwide in a crate labeled Monument Kit, some assembly required. A popular rumor claims that megaliths are evidence of a worldwide ancient maritime civilization that connected every coast and taught everyone the same advanced methods. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and it usually stretches beyond what the evidence can support. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Long-distance contact can exist without global uniformity. It's possible that multiple independent networks existed at different times, overlapping in messy ways and leaving patterns that feel connected, even when they aren't centrally coordinated. That's the cozy truth. The past can look like a conspiracy, simply because it was complicated. Archaeology suggests that cultural contact often appears as partial similarity rather than full sameness. Shared motifs, similar tool types, convergent architectural choices. The evidence we do have points to blended edges, not identical copies. When you see a repeated habit aligning a monument toward a horizon event building with large stones in a ceremonial setting, it might reflect shared human needs, or it might reflect contact, or it might reflect both. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Historians still argue whether specific similarities between distant megalithic traditions require direct contact, indirect contact through intermediaries, or can be explained by independent invention under similar constraints. There's no full consensus. And honestly, if you're listening at bedtime, you should be grateful, because consensus would mean the story ends and you're left with nothing but silence and your own thoughts, which is the true ancient terror. Now your compass becomes a teaching tool. You open it, click, the needle settles. Direction is simple, but routes are not. The ancient world had currents, winds, seasonal windows, and risk. A careful reading might suggest that contact wasn't constant. It could be episodic. A storm pushes a boat off course. A drought forces migration. A marriage alliance brings outsiders into a community. A trader travels a route for a few years, then stops. In that kind of world, knowledge spreads in bursts, not in smooth lines. One interpretation is that monuments themselves can act as nodes in these networks, gathering places where different groups meet during seasonal events. Think of them as ancient conferences, only with fewer PowerPoint slides and more ceremonial walking. People exchange goods, they exchange songs, they exchange techniques. And someone goes home with a new way of tying a rope that makes moving stones slightly less miserable. Now let's allow one gentle fringe tidbit without losing the plot. A fringe idea proposes that certain megalith sites align along global lines or geometric patterns across the earth, as if placed by a single organizing intelligence. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is often thin because with enough points on a globe, you can draw lines between almost anything and call it a pattern. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a reminder of how hungry our minds are for order. We love lines. We love maps. We love the feeling that someone somewhere knew the plan. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you do the calmer thing, you focus on what patterns can reasonably mean. The evidence we do have points to monuments clustering around resources, trade corridors, fertile land, defensible heights, and culturally significant landscapes. A more cautious explanation could be that lines on maps often reflect geography and human movement, not secret geometry. Rivers guide routes, coasts guide travel, valleys guide migration. In other words, the earth draws the lines and humans follow. You walk those lines now in your imagination. A river road, a coastal path, a mountain pass that smells like pine and cold rock. You pass small camps. You pass trading spots where shells change hands and stories change shape. You pass a place where someone is teaching a child how to twist fiber into rope, and it's the most boring-looking moment in the world until you realize rope is how you move. Stones and moving stones is how you make monuments, and monuments are how you make time visible. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So, What does this do to your erased civilization question? It gives you a grounded alternative to the dramatic story. Maybe you don't need one lost civilization. Maybe you need a web, many communities, many roots, occasional contact, shared ideas that travel and mutate. The erasure could be the missing paper trail. No central archive, no written manuals, just skills passed hand to hand. When the chain breaks, the skill fades, and the monument remains like a fossil. And here's the comforting twist that is still wondrous. It means the ancient world was connected enough to share, but human enough to forget. It means the past is not a locked room with one secret key. It's a shoreline after a tide, patterns in the sand, partially erased, still readable if you kneel close and accept that some parts will always be missing. You close the compass lid gently. Click. The needle disappears. The direction stays in your mind anyway. And you keep walking because the next place you're headed isn't a route or a wall. It's a story, myth, and memory, where people explain old stones by inventing older builders, and where the line between history and imagination becomes part of the puzzle itself. You keep walking and the world feels quieter now. Not because the stones have stopped being impressive, but because your mind has started to accept a gentle truth. If techniques can travel without paperwork, then meanings can vanish without a trace. The fan hum continues. The brass compass is still there, reassuringly ordinary. And you arrive at the most human part of the whole megalith mystery. The stories people tell when they inherit something older than their understanding. Most historians agree that myths and origin stories often preserve cultural identity and moral meaning more than precise historical data, and archaeology suggests that communities frequently reinterpret ancient ruins through the lens of their own beliefs. The evidence we do have points to a pattern that shows up everywhere. When you don't know who built something, you don't leave it blank. You fill the blank with the biggest beings you can imagine: giants, gods, legendary ancestors, culture, heroes, or strangers from beyond the horizon. You stand before a weathered stone structure in your mind and feel that impulse yourself. Your brain wants a builder, a name, a motive, a neat story with a beginning and an end. But what's broadly accepted is that the past often doesn't cooperate. Names disappear, languages fade, records don't survive. And then a monument becomes a canvas. One interpretation is that mysterious builders in myth reflect real historical layering. Later people encountered older monuments and honestly didn't know their origins. A careful reading might suggest that this is not deception. It's memory doing what memory does, making sense of the world with the tools available. A more cautious explanation could be that some legends are symbolic rather than literal, encoding values and social roles rather than describing construction events. Either way, the story is a clue, not a certificate. And what if the story is pointing at something else? Not a single hidden truth, but a recurring human reaction. Awe becomes narrative. When people see stonework that feels beyond ordinary life, they assume extraordinary builders. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You can feel it across cultures. A cliffside ruin becomes the work of giants. A stone circle becomes the work of fairies or spirits. A massive wall becomes the work of a legendary king. A temple platform becomes the work of a lost people who vanished. These stories are not proof of a lost civilization, but they might support the idea that monuments outlast cultural memory, creating a gap that legends rush to bridge. A popular rumor claims that all myths point back to one great, forgotten civilization. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and it often cherry-picks similarities while ignoring differences. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Myths can echo each other because humans share fears and hopes. Water, fire, sky ancestors, not because every story comes from a single source. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it's healthier for your brain at bedtime. Now stay with a mainstream anchor because it keeps the night calm. Archaeology suggests that many megalithic sites were reused over long periods, re-entered, reworked, visited, sometimes built upon, meaning that later communities interacted with them without being the original builders. The evidence we do have points to reoccupation layers, later burials, later offerings, later repairs. One interpretation is that reuse creates myth naturally. If you inherit a place, you also inherit the need to explain it. A careful reading might suggest that myth is a kind of cultural maintenance, keeping a monument alive in the mind, even when its original function is gone. Historians still argue whether particular legends about ancient builders preserve kernels of historical contact, or whether they are purely symbolic narratives shaped by later needs. Scholars continue to debate how much historical signal exists inside myth, because it's difficult to separate old memory from later storytelling. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is exactly where this section belongs, right between solid ground and mist. Now let's bring in your truth ladder gently, the way a good host brings snacks quietly and consistently. Documented monuments were built, and later people often encountered them without full knowledge of origins. Interpreted, some myths might reflect that encounter, a cultural attempt to explain inherited stone. Imagined what if you could stand in a village centuries after the builders are gone and listen to the first person invent a story to make the stones make sense? You picture it. A child asks, "Who made that?" An elder hesitates because "I don't know" feels thin in the face of such weight. So the elder says, "Long ago the first people made it," or "giants placed those stones," or "a hero did it with help from the spirits." The child's eyes widen. The monument stays meaningful. The blank is filled. And here's a gentle modern aside, because you deserve at least one soft laugh per 1,000 words. This is basically the ancient version of reading a confusing instruction manual and saying, "Yeah, sure, I assembled it while one screw remains on the floor." Except the manual is time, and the screw is the entire explanation of how the monument was built. You smile and move on because the chair is mostly stable, and honestly, that's how cultures handle the past too. One interpretation is that stories about vanished people can emerge from real demographic change, migration, assimilation, language shifts, conquest, intermarriage, disease, forces that can transform a region's identity within a few generations. A more cautious explanation could be that vanished often means absorbed, because people rarely disappear completely. They blend, change names, adapt. The evidence we do have points to continuity and mixing in many regions rather than total erasure. And yet the feeling of erasure is real. You can stand on old stones and sense a missing voice. This raises the possibility that the erased civilization in your title is not a single mysterious empire, but the cumulative effect of many small erasures, oral traditions, broken skills, lost coastlines, submerged records, never written sacred meanings reinterpreted. The stones become the loudest surviving evidence, and because they are loud, they attract big stories. A fringe idea proposes that myths about teachers from the sea or civilizers from elsewhere indicate actual external visitors who introduced monument building. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is often too thin to separate metaphor from history. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a gentle question. What if some myths preserve distant contacts, rare, episodic, easily exaggerated over time? That would not require a global lost civilization, only human travel and human storytelling. Now you open the brass compass again. Click. The needle settles. You realize how much you like this ritual. It's your way of returning to solid ground when the mist gets poetic. What's broadly accepted is that archaeology relies on physical evidence, and stories are valuable but slippery. The evidence we do have points to myths being shaped by later values. A careful reading might suggest that when a society wants to emphasize divine legitimacy, it attributes monuments to gods. When it wants to emphasize heroic leadership, it attributes them to kings. When it wants to explain sudden change, it invents a lost people. The monument becomes a mirror. And what if in some cases that mirror reflects a real encounter with older stonework, an inherited technology or style that later builders could admire but not replicate in the same way? This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it's a plausible bridge between your mainstream frame and your mystery mood. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So, by the end of this section, you're holding a calmer kind of wonder. Myths don't prove a lost civilization. Instead, they reveal the human urge to make meaning when evidence is missing. They show you how megaliths can outlive their context so completely that language rushes in to do the repair work. You close the compass lid softly. Click. The stories continue without you. The stones continue without anyone. And you keep walking because the next step is to stare straight at the gaps in the record, the missing middle, and ask gently and honestly what absence really means. You keep walking, and after myth and memory, the night feels a little more honest, like you've turned down the brightness on your imagination just enough to see what's actually there. The fan hum stays steady. The brass compass feels heavier now, not because it gained weight, but because you've learned what it represents: restraint, direction without certainty, wonder without overreach. And now you arrive at the most uncomfortable clue of all, the one that doesn't glitter and doesn't stack neatly: the gap. Most historians agree that the archaeological record is incomplete and uneven, and archaeology suggests that what survives depends on material environment and sheer luck. The evidence we do have points to a simple reality: absence is not always evidence of non-existence. Sometimes it's evidence of rot, flood, fire, rebuilding, or the fact that nobody has dug in the right place yet. You can feel how tempting this is, how easily the mind uses missing pages to invent a whole hidden library. So we do this carefully. What's broadly accepted is that stone preserves better than wood leather. Textiles and food remains and even stone can be quarried away, reused, or buried. Archaeology suggests that many ancient settlements were built from perishable materials that leave faint traces. The evidence we do have points to entire lifeways that can vanish almost completely if they weren't written down or built in durable materials. A careful reading might suggest that we're often looking at the past through a keyhole. We see the parts that fossilize, not the parts people lived in most. One interpretation is that some mysterious megaliths feel disconnected because the surrounding everyday evidence is missing. A more cautious explanation could be that the everyday evidence exists but is subtle soil stains, post holes, scattered fragments, and requires careful excavation and interpretation. In other words, the story might be there just in faint pencil instead of bold marker. You kneel in your imagination, not at a monument, but at a patch of earth beside it. You picture archaeologists working slowly, brushing, measuring, recording. No dramatic theme music, just patience. The evidence we do have points to how easy it is to miss things one storm can rearrange sediments. One later construction can disturb layers. One mistaken assumption can cause a site to be misread. That's not a failure of archaeology. It's the challenge of time. Now let's bring in the cozy honesty you need for this section. The missing middle can mean a few different things. It might mean the site is older than previously thought. And dating is difficult because stone itself doesn't hold an easy clock. It might mean the site was used intermittently, leaving gaps between phases. It might mean the people who built it didn't live right next to it, because monuments can be gathering places, not neighborhoods. It might mean later activity disturbed earlier evidence. And sometimes, yes, sometimes it might mean we genuinely don't know yet. That's where the mist starts whispering. A popular rumor claims that archaeologists ignore evidence of a lost civilization on purpose. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and it misunderstands how the field usually works. Archaeologists argue with each other, constantly publish disagreements, revise timelines, and change their minds when new data appears. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The record is incomplete, mostly because preservation is cruel and research is slow, not because of a coordinated refusal to see. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's the more realistic baseline. Still, the gap remains, and your big question leans into it. What if the gaps hide something significant? A fringe idea proposes that the missing evidence represents an earlier high civilization erased by catastrophe, leaving only megaliths behind. This theory isn't widely accepted, and in many cases, the evidence is too thin to support it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can frame it more responsibly. What if there were earlier, more complex, regional societies than we currently recognize, whose perishable evidence didn't survive, and whose stone legacies were later reused or misattributed? Notice how that version stays human. It doesn't require sci-fi. It requires humility about preservation. Historians still argue whether certain abrupt transitions in material culture reflect sudden population replacement, gradual assimilation, shifts in trade and ideology, or changes in climate and subsistence, because the same gap can be explained in multiple ways. Scholars continue to debate how to interpret silence in the record, and there's no full consensus. That uncertainty is not an invitation to invent anything you want. It's an invitation to stay curious without pretending you know. Now bring your compass back. You open it. Click. The needle settles. And you remember direction is not a destination. It's a method. The method here is to ask what kinds of evidence would we expect if there were an erased civilization. Written records, not always. Durable tools, maybe, but many could corrode or be recycled. Distinctive pottery or art styles. Possibly, but those can be absorbed and transformed. Settlement remains likely, but submerged coastlines and perishable architecture can hide them. The evidence we do have points to how often the most civilization-looking evidence is the hardest to preserve because it's made of things that disappear. One interpretation is that megaliths stand out precisely because they're the survivors, not necessarily because they're the most representative. A careful reading might suggest that if you only found the stone foundations of our world, you'd invent a strange story about us too. They worshipped rectangles, you'd say. They had a cult of parking lots, and honestly, you wouldn't be completely wrong. Now, you let that thought soften you because it gives you empathy for the past. You can't demand that ancient people leave evidence in the form you prefer. They lived in their own material reality. Archaeology suggests that many regions have undiscovered sites, and that new techniques, remote sensing, improved dating methods, underwater archaeology can change what we know. The evidence we do have points to ongoing discovery, reshaping timelines and connections. That might support the idea that some of today's gaps are temporary, not permanent. But again, let's keep solid ground separate from missed discovery doesn't guarantee a lost super civilization. It guarantees that we will learn more details about human variation and adaptation. And what if the most important missing middle isn't a missing empire, but a missing understanding of how societies organize without leaving obvious traces? Seasonal gatherings, mobile communities, trade networks without cities, ritual sites without permanent settlements. These are real possibilities supported in many places by growing evidence, and they can produce impressive monuments without the infrastructure you expect. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So, by the end of this section, you've done something quietly powerful. You've learned to sit with absence. You've learned that not knowing is not a void to be filled with certainty. It's a space to be held with careful language and steady curiosity. And you carry that into the next step because now that you understand gaps you can face, the biggest fork in the road are similarities between distant megalith traditions, a sign of contact or coincidence, or some mixture that keeps slipping between our fingers. You close the compass lid. Click. The needle disappears, but the method remains. And you keep walking toward that debate, calm and unhurried. You keep walking, and the night feels like it's been designed for thinking without panic. The fan hum is steady, your breathing is steady, and the brass compass is steady in your palm, your little reminder that the goal isn't to win an argument, but to move gently through uncertainty. Now you arrive at the biggest fork in the megalith conversation. The one that's been quietly waiting behind everything we've said so far are the similarities between distant monuments, evidence of contact, or evidence of human minds solving similar problems in similar ways. Most historians agree that independent invention is common in human history, and archaeology suggests that similar environmental constraints often lead to similar solutions, especially when the problem is as universal as build something that lasts. The evidence we do have points to people everywhere discovering leverage, discovering ramps, discovering the usefulness of straight lines, discovering that rocks are heavy and gravity is rude. So, yes, coincidence convergence can explain a lot. But also most historians agree that ancient peoples were not isolated, and archaeology suggests that trade and migration connected many regions. The evidence we do have points to long-distance movement of materials and motifs in many eras. So, contact can explain a lot too. And your job tonight is not to choose one as a religion. Your job is to hold both like two warm stones in your hands and notice how they feel. One interpretation is that some megalith similarities reflect shared human needs, memorialize ancestors, mark time, demonstrate social power, create communal gathering spaces. A careful reading might suggest that when societies develop surplus and coordination, monumental building becomes a natural expression of identity. And what if the repeated shape of monuments around the world is not a single blueprint, but a shared human instinct? If you want to be remembered, you build with what refuses to rot. A more cautious explanation could be that many similarities are broad categories rather than precise matches. A stone circle is not automatically the same as a stone platform. A dolmen is not automatically the same as a polygonal wall. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But you also can't ignore the moments when similarity feels strangely specific. The way certain stones are oriented, the way certain joints are treated, the way certain myths cluster around builders before us. Those are the moments where the contact argument leans forward in its chair. It's possible that ideas traveled through chains of intermediate contacts, where no single person crossed an ocean, but the idea still moved like a song passed from village to village, until it arrives somewhere far away in a new accent. Archaeology suggests this kind of diffusion is plausible in many contexts. The evidence we do have points to cultural features spreading in patchwork ways rather than as a single wave. Now the mist arrives with its favorite dramatic version of this fork. A popular rumor claims that a single ancient global civilization planted megaliths everywhere, leaving a unified pattern that proves their existence. This rumor isn't widely accepted, and it usually requires more certainty than the evidence can provide. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Global patterns can emerge from mixed causes. Some independent invention, some contact, some coincidence, some later interpretation. If we treat the global civilization idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic lens. What if the stones are hinting at broader connectivity than we currently appreciate without requiring one master empire behind everything? That's a possibility, not a certainty. Now let's do something soothing. Imagine a simple scale. On one end, pure coincidence. Everyone independently builds big stones because stone is durable and humans like durable things. On the other end, total contact. Everyone is connected by one network with one shared tradition. Most likely, based on what the evidence we do have, points to many cases fall somewhere in the middle. Some techniques likely emerged repeatedly. Some likely spread. Some sites may have been influenced indirectly. Some may have no connection at all, except shared humanity. Historians still argue whether the most striking cross-cultural similarities in megalithic architecture require direct contact, indirect diffusion, or can be fully explained by independent invention, and there's no full consensus. Scholars continue to debate the balance because each case has its own evidence and its own gaps. Now let's add one small practical rule that helps you stay sane. Specificity matters. If two monuments share only the broad fact of being made of stone and being large, that's not strong evidence of contact. But if you see a cluster of specific shared features, construction sequencing, unusual joint styles, similar ritual placements, similar measurement systems, similar quarry-to-site logistics, then contact becomes more interesting. Even then, it's suggestive, not conclusive, because humans can converge on effective solutions. But specificity is where the debate becomes real. One interpretation is that some megalithic traditions may have functioned like open-source engineering. People observe, imitate, modify, and improve. A careful reading might suggest that once a community sees a successful method, there's no reason not to adopt it. A more cautious explanation could be that adoption depends on local resources and cultural fit. You can't just copy a technique if you don't have the right wood, the right stone, the right labor structure, or the right social reason. So even contact doesn't guarantee similarity. Sometimes contact creates difference because ideas get adapted. And now, because your brain is trying to stay awake to solve the puzzle, here's a gentle humor moment to nudge it back towards sleep. Imagine ancient builders as the original comment section. One group builds a stone circle. Another group hears about it and says, "Nice, but ours will be bigger." Another group says, "Cool, but we're doing polygons now." And somewhere a skeptical person mutters, "It's all just rocks," while standing in front of a rock that took 3 generations to place. People have always had opinions. The only difference is that ancient opinions didn't come with emojis, just dramatic size. Now bring the compass back in for the calming reset. Click. The needle steadies. It doesn't pick a side. It points quietly to method. The method is compare case by case. Respect geography, respect time, respect that similar outcomes can have different causes. This raises the possibility that your original question, megaliths, pointing to a civilization erased from history, might be reframed. What if they point not to one erased civilization, but to a pattern of partial forgetting within many civilizations? What if connectivity existed, but it was messy and episodic? What if independent invention happened, but it happened in a world where people still occasionally met, traded, and shared? In that mixed world, you can get both global echoes and local uniqueness. A fringe idea proposes that megaliths align with a deliberate global grid or energy system, implying coordinated planning at planetary scale. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is often too thin to separate pattern seeking from pattern making. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it functions best as a poetic thought. What if humans everywhere felt certain places were charged and chose to build there? That doesn't require invisible energies to be meaningful. It can reflect geography symbolism and shared human awe. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So, by the end of this section, you've done the hardest thing. You've resisted the temptation to choose a single explanation because it feels satisfying. You've kept the solid ground separate from the mist. You've accepted that the past can be both connected and independent, both shared and diverse. And now, with that balance in hand, you're ready for the closing stretch of the night, the part where you gather everything: human skill trade, myth, disasters, gaps, debates, and you hold it up to the question one last time, not to solve it, but to settle into it. Because the end of a bedtime history isn't a verdict. It's a softer mind. You keep walking, but the pace naturally slows now, like your thoughts are easing into a softer rhythm without you even asking. The fan hum blends with everything we've imagined: ocean wind, mountain air, grassland hush, until it all becomes one steady background sound. The brass compass sits in your palm lid closed, as if it knows the night is almost done. Most historians agree that the world's megaliths were built by human communities using organization skill and time and archaeology, suggests that these monuments often served social ritual and political purposes that could shift across generations. The evidence we do have points to something both simple and astonishing: ordinary people and extraordinary coordination making durable statements in stone. And yet, you also know what it feels like to stand in front of a seam. You can barely see a block. You can barely imagine moving an alignment that catches the light on a particular morning. Those feelings are real. The wonder is real. The question is what you do with it. One interpretation is that megaliths point to a lost civilization because they feel like survivors from a story we don't fully possess. A careful reading might suggest that the erasure is less a single event and more 1,000 small erasures, coastlines that shifted wood, that rotted languages, that disappeared, craft traditions that broke rituals, that changed myths, that replaced manuals. A more cautious explanation could be that what remains looks disconnected because the everyday context is missing, not because it never existed. Historians still argue whether the strongest apparent cross-cultural patterns in megalith building reflect direct contact, indirect diffusion, or independent invention under similar constraints, and there's no full consensus. Scholars continue to debate case by case because the past is a mosaic. Some tiles fit neatly, some are cracked, and some are still buried under dust. Now you take a slow breath and hold your truth ladder in your mind like 3 gentle shelves. Documented humans built these monuments with known physical principles and social organization. Interpreted, some patterns may suggest contact-shared techniques or inherited foundations in certain places, but the evidence varies. Imagined what if, in a few moments and regions, there were knowledge peaks, craft lineages, seasonal alliances, coastal networks, whose details did not survive, leaving stone as the loudest remaining witness. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. A fringe idea proposes that a single, erased global civilization once stitched the world together and left megaliths as its calling cards. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it's important to keep saying that gently and clearly. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still do something valuable for you at bedtime. It can frame the stones as invitations to humility. Not humility as shame, but humility as openness. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Because here's what's quietly true, and also kind of comforting: the past is not obligated to be fully readable. You open the brass compass one last time. Click. The needle steadies. You stare at that tiny certainty inside a world of uncertainty and feel your shoulders soften. That's what we're doing too. We're not forcing certainty where it doesn't belong. We're letting the needle settle where the evidence supports it, and we're letting the rest remain mist. Now let's gather the clues, the way you'd gather blankets, one layer at a time. The first layer is human physics. Ropes, levers, ramps, friction, gravity. None of it is magical. All of it is powerful. The second layer is human society. Cooperation, ritual, leadership, obligation, celebration, pride. The third layer is human memory, myths, filling gaps, stories, naming the unknown, later cultures, inheriting stones without inheriting manuals. The fourth layer is nature, floods, earthquakes, erosion, sea level rise times editing tools. The fifth layer is the record itself. Patchy, uneven, sometimes underwater, sometimes undiscovered, sometimes too subtle to see from the surface. And when you pile those layers together, the world's megaliths start to look less like proofs of a single hidden truth, and more like intersections, places where many forces meet. Human ambition meets geology. Ritual meets engineering. Memory meets erasure. So what if the world's megaliths point to a civilization erased from history? Here is the calmest, most responsible answer you can carry to sleep. They might point to many erasures rather than one. They might point to lost contexts, lost connections, lost names, and lost techniques without requiring a single global lost empire. They might support the idea that ancient people were more connected, more inventive, and more coordinated than we sometimes picture. And they might also remind you that the most durable evidence is not always the most complete. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's a possibility, not a certainty, that some monuments incorporate older phases or inherited knowledge. It's also a strong possibility, supported broadly, that human skill and social organization can explain the construction. Both can live in the same room. You don't have to evict one to host the other. And now the wind down begins because your mind has done enough lifting for one night. You let the compass close. The click is soft, almost like a lullaby. You imagine setting it down on a stone surface that's cool and smooth. You picture stepping back from the monument, not to leave it behind, but to stop demanding an answer from it. The stones don't owe you a confession. They are not a courtroom witness. They are more like a deep, patient instrument that plays one note over centuries, remember. Your breathing slows, your thoughts lengthen, the images soften at the edges. You see the rope again, thick and frayed, pulled by hands that are long gone. You see the sand sprinkled as an abrasive grain by grain smoothing a surface until it fits. You see a gathering at dawn, people standing quietly as sunlight finds a notch in the horizon. You see a child asking who built this, and an elder answering with a story that is half truth and half comfort. You see a shoreline that used to be dry land. You see waves moving in and out, erasing footprints but leaving the heavier shapes. You see a wall in the mountains that flexes slightly when the earth trembles, then settles again, as if it knows how to survive without fighting. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And as you let all these scenes fade together, you realize the question wasn't only about a lost civilization. It was about you here now in a world that forgets quickly, trying to touch something that doesn't. You don't need to solve it. You only need to feel the calm awe of it. So you let the monuments stand in the distance, quiet silhouettes under a sky that keeps its rhythm. You let the debates stay unresolved where they belong. You let the solid ground stay under your feet and the mist stay in the air, and you let your mind do the most ancient human thing it can do at the end of a long day. You rest,